I slowly started to notice my surroundings once more, and my thoughts started to come out of the fog in my head. My mood was reflected in the semi-darkness of my basement workshop, which was only partially illuminated by the light coming from the open door. I was still working on one of my rackets. It was clamped in a vise on the workbench. I sat in my worn-out chair, listening to the sounds of our two youngest kids playing in the rec room and watching a Disney movie on the VCR on the other side of the partition. I looked at the wall clock and realized I had been sitting there with my head spinning for more than 30 minutes. I stayed put, not moving, not looking, trying to work out what I was glad I hadn't heard. After dinner on Sunday night, my spouse Sally cleaned the kitchen and did the dishes, and I headed to my workroom to adjust some rackets in preparation for the racquetball leagues that start in the fall. For the past 7 or 8 years, I had been an avid player, spending several mornings before I left to work as an engineer at General Motors. Every fall, winter, and spring session, I participated in at least one evening league. Being able to play consistently in the A bracket and improving fairly quickly was something I was proud of. Several times a year, I competed in local tournaments and consistently finished first. At 6 feet 2 inches, I was able to maintain a consistent weight of about 200 pounds while playing racquetball. I dreaded the day when she would get older and everything would change, but for now, Jessie, our 7-year-old daughter, didn't seem to mind as she followed me to the game room to watch her favorite movie, followed by our 4-year-old toddler, Allison. Ally was at that age where Jessie couldn't go anywhere without her wanting to tag along. Now 9 years old, our son Jason understood that he was the oldest of the 3 boys and therefore not to be expected to play with his younger sisters. Instead, he would probably spend his time building or playing with his model cars and airplanes in his room. Luckily, Jason shared many of the Robinson clan's physical characteristics, including brown hair, hazel eyes, a strong chin, and a prominent but not overly large nose. Jessie had Sally's red hair and fine facial features, and Ally had blonde hair and, despite being young, appeared to combine both of our features. I looked in on the girls. They were in the middle of Lady and the Tramp, so I decided to head back upstairs. As I climbed the stairs in my socks and approached the partially open door to the basement, I heard Sally talking on the phone in a quiet, low voice, and it occurred to me that maybe I could sneak up on her and give her a little surprise. I thought about setting the mood for something later in the day, even though we'd already had a morning of mattress cuddling like we usually did on the weekend. I walked over to the door and peered through the crack to see where she was. Perfect, I thought, beaming with pride. Sally was still gorgeous, about 5 feet 6 inches tall and under 130 pounds, thanks to a healthy diet and regular exercise, even after 3 children and 10 years of marriage. Compared to when we were married, when I was only a year older and she was 23 years old, she looked even better now. Over the years, our sexual life had slowed down due to the kids, but we still made time for ourselves a few times a week on average. I heard the conversation over the phone as I slowly opened the door wider. She said, "The schedule is Tuesday and Thursday from 9 to 3, as I heard." There was a pause while she heard the other person on the phone. "Yes, I can talk. Phil is in the basement with the girls right now." "Why?" "Yeah, I think so too, Debbie. I've been thinking about it a lot lately. This coming weekend. I don't think we have anything on the calendar. I could probably do it." Now I know. She was conversing with her colleague and boss, Debbie Bradshaw. She replied, it seemed that they were organizing a different weekend shopping excursion, which took place 3 or 4 times a year. I eased the door open further and began to move quickly toward the prize that was calling to me when I was startled to a halt by an odd noise. Sally was laughing. What on earth was that? She burst out laughing once more as she paid attention to Debbie's words. The thing that shocked me the most was that I couldn't remember Sally laughing that much since our honeymoon. She then lowered her voice, and I made out, sure would like to try that thing again before the word comes off. All of a sudden, that comment brought to mind a discussion I'd had a few months prior in a bar. I began to feel lightheaded. I crouched down on the basement step and shut the door carefully. Sally was practically whispering into the phone as she laughed. All I could hear were the sporadic words. I stood in the dark of the stairwell as she started to wrap up the conversation. Last time I was really on a roll. I know. Yeah, both of you tell him I'll see him. I can't wait. I turned and walked quietly down the stairs into my workshop, stumbling in as I suddenly didn't want her to know I was there. I sank into a chair and thought back on the exchange. I recalled it from last spring, following one of our Wednesday night racquetball league's final matches. We did this about once a month, after which we went to a bar for a few beers. It was just Craig Davis, John Harrison, and me after about an hour. John and Craig had joined the Oak Park Y a few years prior and were best friends. Craig preferred soft drinks only, while John enjoyed beer. Over time, I discovered that he was an alcoholic who had given up a few years prior. I was told that his wife was very irritated by his inability to recover from a few beers, but he still enjoyed the atmosphere at the bar and would always join the crowd. That was the only issue I could find with his alcoholism. John and Craig were married, and John had 2 kids and Craig had 1. The jokes and conversation turned to women, as usual, after the matches. I discovered after a dozen drinks at the bar that these 2 weren't interested in making jokes, and on a few instances, they showed an unusual level of interest in my life and marriage, which made me uneasy. I've at least had 1 beer and then left to avoid the topic. Craig had been harassing John about his wife, Mary, that evening. She was demanding that he have very private surgery. I assumed he meant a vasectomy and mentioned that Sally had mentioned wanting me to do it so she could stop taking the pills, but we hadn't reached a consensus yet. Craig's smile persisted, but John's expression turned worried. "Oh no, it seems she wants him to cut out the wart," Craig exclaimed, practically giggling. "I guess I'm lost. What are you talking about?" I asked, looking perplexed. John blushed a little and pointed out that he had a regular wart right there. Upon seeing him in the shower, though not up close enough to detect the wart, I laughed this time. He acknowledged that his wife was beginning to get scared of the wart because it had gotten bigger over the past few years. While Mary, John's wife, insisted that the wart had a purpose, John insisted that it should be removed, even if it meant she would lose something in the process. I got the impression that John was more upset about his wife losing the advantage he had over other women than he was about her losing money. It seems that his wart was a common conversation starter and that when he attempted to get women other than his wife into bed, it piqued curiosity. Around this time, I made the decision to leave because I felt that this was becoming too personal for me. I was sitting in the dark now, ruminating over that exchange. I simply could not believe Sally could have anything to do with what her phone call had implied. Sally was aware that the people I played racquetball with were John and Craig because I had mentioned them on multiple occasions previously and because their names were typically on the match schedule I maintained on our calendar. But they had never met, as far as I knew. No matter how hard I tried to deny it, the dots continued to connect. I started to perspire and had the impression that I was in the dark. I fervently hoped there was a logical explanation because I just couldn't believe Sally could have done something like that. And Debbie was clearly in on whatever was going on as well. About 5 years ago, Debbie Bradshaw, Sally's supervisor, was moved from corporate headquarters outside of Detroit to the position of assistant manager at the store where Sally was employed. After graduating from college, she had worked at the same store before relocating to a large city to receive management training. Debbie met Josh, a financial controller, while she was employed in Detroit, and the two became married. Josh, according to Sally, was her second husband. When Sally became pregnant with Ally and Debbie became pregnant with Shannon, their first and so far only child, they became friends. Sally and Debbie were roughly the same age. Debbie and Sally became even closer after both babies were born within a month of one another. Over the years, we had a few social encounters with Debbie and Josh, usually at some kind of work-related function. We might have been financially inferior to them and did not belong to the same social circles. Debbie was a lovely, intelligent, blonde with green eyes, but she always seemed to demand attention. Josh always gave me the impression that his job came first, even though he seemed like a decent enough guy. About 2 years ago, John and Craig signed up for the Wise Racquetball League. John was the owner of a construction company, and Craig managed a residential construction company where his father-in-law was the senior partner. We had a lot in common because we were all married, had families, and were roughly the same age. Strangely enough, though, we never really chatted until after a racquetball match or when we stopped in for a few beers. As is frequently the case when you start interacting with new people, our families have never met. It turns out that you know people in common and have mutual friends. When I brought up the store where Sally worked one day, John mentioned he knew someone who also worked there. It was, in fact, Debbie Bradshaw. Debbie graduated 1 year behind John and Craig from the same high school. He mentioned that they get together a few times a year. About 2 years ago, when our youngest child, Ally, was going through the terrible twos, the shopping excursion began. Sally was particularly awful with Ally for a few months. Jessie attended daycare, meaning she spent half of her day at home as well, juggling 3 children, a house, and a job a couple of days a week, all of which were exhausting her. I was working extra hours every week on a project that was assigned to me, so I wasn't much help at the time. It got to the point where one evening, after everyone had gone to bed, she broke down in tears of exhaustion and frustration on the couch. She finally calmed down when I took her up in my arms and held her. She expressed her dissatisfaction with the situation and said that she would be relieved if she could just occasionally take a break from it. I was so disappointed that I was unable to spend as much time with the kids as I should have that I offered to take full responsibility for the kids on her next day off if she desired time away. She thanked me profusely and promised to give it some thought. A few weeks later, Sally reported that she had discussed her need to get away from the children with Debbie. Debbie proposed that the two of them go shopping and check out some upscale malls in the Detroit suburbs. Debbie was certain her spouse wouldn't object. I was hesitant to give her credit card access to an upscale mall, but I eventually agreed. So Sally and Debbie took off for Detroit on Saturday morning during my next free weekend. They made stops at one of the malls and for breakfast along the way. They had lunch, checked into a motel, went to a movie, and had dinner. I made her call me as soon as she checked in and gave me the room number and phone number, and she complied before I left. They left the hotel the following morning, went to another mall, had lunch, and then headed back home at around 5 o'clock. Sally was so appreciative of the trip that she gave me a hug and a kiss as soon as she entered and spoke extensively about the shops and eateries. She purchased a few lovely items for the kids and herself rather than going on an extravagant shopping binge. I had no complaints because I was happy for her and the kids treated me really well. It was more than 2 years ago. Somehow, shopping trips on their own turned into a regular occurrence after that weekend. The two of them would go on Saturday mornings and return late on Sunday nights every 3 or 4 months. I didn't mind too much because I liked spending time by myself with the kids, and Sally seemed to like it too. I tried to recall if things had changed since the beginning of these trips. I recalled that following the first trip, she had been in a very different mental state when she returned the second time. She appeared glum, depressed, and possibly a little anxious for some reason. On Sunday night, I informed her of this and inquired about her problem. I knew that she occasionally had blue discharge, but she retorted that it was nothing more than that she had had her period. The more I considered it, the more I understood that we never made love the night she returned or for a few days following it. However, we always did it a few days before she left, and Sally was always on the upswing, almost giddy, when the trips continued in the week before one of them. I wondered now about this time, even though I hadn't really thought about it before. I just sat there, trying to clear my head when I heard Sally calling to me from the top of the stairs, "Phil, it's bath time for the girls. Can you send them upstairs?" I got up from my chair and said, Phil, can you hear me?" I went to the bottom of the stairs and angrily called out to her, "Yes, I heard you. I'll get them." I went into the bathroom and, following a disagreement, escorted the children out. I picked up and put things away as I wandered around the room after they had climbed the stairs, mostly to pass the time. I had to collect myself and suppress the raging emotions inside of me. I finally went back upstairs because I could not wait any longer. When I opened the kitchen door, Sally was flipping through a cookbook. She turned her head back, grinned, and asked, "Is something wrong, honey?" before meeting my eyes. I muttered something awkward about breaking a favorite racket, but my eyes were fixed on hers, searching for anything that could validate my suspicions. But she was just Sally, the woman I loved. There was nothing to see. She gave me another kiss and laughed. Her eyes narrowed at those words, as if a veil had fallen over them. "Debbie called while you were downstairs. She wanted to know if we could go shopping at the end of next week." She blinked and turned her head away from my intense stare. She was hiding something, and I realized right away. How long has this been going on? I tried desperately to come up with a way to put off this trip until I could come up with something, anything. I said, not very convincingly, "Don't we have something planned for next weekend?" "It's not listed on the calendar," she answered. "I think there's a VFW event on Saturday night, and I thought we should attend," I replied slowly. Sally moved away from me and gave me a questioning look. "Phil, you know I don't like going to these events. I don't care if Dad goes too. All you guys do is talk about Army stuff and drink too much. It bores me to tears, so if you want to go, just get a babysitter while I'm gone." "Then why don't we do something with the kids this weekend? Cedar Point will be open for a few more weeks before it closes for the season, and we haven't taken Ally with us once yet. She's old enough to enjoy it," I said, reaching for a straw. Sally scowled, her face turning red as it usually does when she's really pissed off. I was a little irritated and said, "Never mind, I just thought we could do something together. You and Debbie are having a good time. I'm going to go upstairs and make sure the kids go to bed." I turned and headed up the stairs toward the bedrooms. "We just took the kids to Ma Island over Labor Day weekend. That was only a couple of weeks ago. What's gotten into you, Phil? You've never objected to me shopping before." I turned around halfway down and noticed Sally staring at me oddly. I kept myself away from any meaningful conversation with her for the remainder of the evening. I went to bed before Sally, as I do most work nights, and tried to sleep. I heard her coming inside and going to the bathroom to get into her pajamas after a while. She nestled against my back as she slid into bed. She put her arms around me and murmured, "Phil, Phil." I kept breathing regularly and shallowly while pretending to sleep. She gave up eventually and moved away from me. When she did eventually fall asleep, I could tell by the way she breathed. I turned onto my back and tried to gather my thoughts as I stared at the ceiling. I traveled back in time and thought back on my life's journey to this moment. My mom, dad, my elder sister, and I were a typical middle-class family when I was growing up, less than 20 miles from our current residence. My childhood was most interesting because of my best friend, Jason, or Jace as we all used to call him. We were at one end of the block and his family was at the other. Since we first connected in the 4th grade, we have been best friends. I was at his house if he wasn't at ours. Every week, at least one of us stayed at the other's house for at least one night. He was Mr. Personality. He never failed to make friends wherever he went, always had a good sense of humor, and laughed a lot. In contrast, I was more reserved and introspective. We were complementary to one another. Together, we began noticing girls as we grew older, played sports, and went on lots of dates. In the final few months before prom, we both succeeded in losing our virginity, even though neither of us had a committed relationship with a single girl. We weren't particularly good students, but I typically did better than Jace. I found that I liked drafting as a hobby in high school. I had taken every drafting course available by the time I was a senior in high school, and I was thinking seriously about going into engineering. I chose to enroll in a local junior college with an engineering technology program after high school. It was close enough to live at home and commute to work, and it was reasonably priced. Despite being unsure of his career goals, Jace enrolled in general education classes. The deferment from the military draft was the largest benefit. At the conclusion of my first year, I made a major error. On Saturday night, Jace and I went to a college party, and on the way home, I was stopped. I spent the night in the county jail after failing the breathalyzer test. I was bailed out the next morning by my parents, who were understandably furious. All in all, I lost my driver's license for a year and had to use all of my savings to pay fines and court costs. Throughout the remainder of the semester, I gave Jay rides on my moped. Being broke without a driver's license gave me no incentive to go to school, so eventually I said, screw it. I made the risky decision to enlist in the Army the following year. I reasoned that since I had studied drafting, I could avoid Vietnam by working as an engineer. That's what the recruiter told me, anyhow. He lied, of course. Jace made the decision to accompany me right away when I told him about my plans. The recruiter assured us that we would train together if we enlisted as buddies. So we left. Although challenging, basic training was bearable. We underwent a series of aptitude tests halfway through our training to ascertain the type of work we would be best suited for. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, determined that as fire control specialists, we would be the most useful to the Green Machine. The work involved using what the Army referred to as an FDC computer, which was actually a sophisticated calculator that determined azimuths, distances, and the quantity of explosive charges needed to hit an artillery shell. We were sent to Fort S to learn a new trade after completing our basic training. Even though Seoul wasn't a particularly pleasant place, we managed to have some fun because of Jace. But the next surprise we received was far more amazing than that. Just a few weeks prior to graduation, orders to travel to Vietnam were received. We took the lengthy flight to the Republic of Vietnam after spending 15 days on vacation visiting family, drinking beer with old friends, and chasing after a few of our former girlfriends. We both managed to get assigned to Battery A, 2nd Battalion, 11th Artillery Brigade after some discussion with the personnel officers. By November 1969, Nixon had started to withdraw troops as the plan to turn the war over to the South Vietnamese gained traction. That was such a joke. There was very little fighting during the first 5 or 6 months. Throughout the years, we flew many sorties from fire support bases, but we were only involved in a few raids. Our trip to Bangkok, Thailand, was the high point of our tour thus far. Jace and I were worn out from our 15 days of fun and drinking, so we went back to our apartment in the hopes of sleeping. Not very exciting was the news that during our absence, our unit had been attached to the 1001st Airborne Corps' 3rd Brigade. However, I had a bad feeling a few days later when our battery was airlifted to a lonely hill in the middle of the darkest, deepest bush I'd seen since coming to Vietnam. I was carried home on a stretcher 4 months later. Jace returned home in a cadaver bag. My physical and mental health were severely compromised due to the trauma I had experienced. I was in a rehab facility for a few months after spending a few weeks in the hospital. I also saw a psychiatrist for a while in an attempt to make sense of everything that had transpired. I was returned to Fort S to work as an assistant instructor in the training brigade after being deemed nearly fit for duty once more. I enrolled in classes at the local college and buried myself in writing assignments during my off-duty hours because I didn't want to talk to anyone else. I requested early release after a year of service. Since Vietnam was coming to an end, I could return to school. There were more soldiers in the Army. The closest university to my home accepted me into their engineering training program after I applied. I served for 2 years and 7 months, and after the Army granted my request, I was released 5 months ahead of schedule. I then went back to living with my parents and filed for veterans benefits. I didn't have many needs when I was at home. While still serving in Vietnam, I saved the majority of my money, and I was able to pay for my expenses with the money I earned from my part-time job and my education benefits. In retrospect, I realized that I was a normal, or maybe stereotypical, shell-shocked, bewildered Vietnam veteran. I became a bitter, reclusive recluse as a result of my injuries, what I saw and did, and society's response to the war and those involved. I developed a beard and grew my hair down. I wore an old, beat-up Army field jacket or a hooded sweatshirt most of the time. Worn sneakers and tattered jeans finished off my look. I took the walk to work, home, and school. I know my parents, Sister Terry, and I were worried about me, but I simply stopped feeling like I was involved in society. I continued to see a therapist approximately once a month, but it didn't really help. I would go see Jace's parents about once a week, and we would talk about him and our happy times together. It was the least I could do for them, and they seemed to enjoy it. I was sitting in the International Center's study hall on campus one afternoon. I used the few hours I had between classes on a few days of the week to read or study while attempting to block out the sounds around me. My focus was broken by a voice. I asked, casting a sidelong glance at the man seated across the table, "Mind if I sit here?" His long red hair and the flawless pale complexion that only a true redhead could pull off astounded me. Brown eyes met mine with curiosity and patience as they awaited a response. I nervously licked my lips, wondering what her flawlessly shaped red lips would look like on mine. She asked again, "Do you mind if I sit here?" And I was so lost in thought that I stumbled over my words and said, "No, go ahead," as she put her books down and took out a chair to sit. With my eyes wide open, I observed her closely. She was really well built, weighed about 20 pounds, and was probably 7 or 8 inches shorter than me. She spent the next 30 minutes lost in her books, and me pretending to be glued to mine. I would occasionally glance at her and be amazed by her appearance. I nodded in response to her question. "Are you a veteran?" she asked, pointing to my field jacket the 5th or 6th time I looked up and saw that she was staring at me. Then she said, "Vietnam?" I winced at her question because the response was usually not kind, but I just nodded and moved on. I started to feel better after a short while when she joyfully revealed, "My dad is a veteran. He served in the Korean War. He was a Marine. Subsequently," she stated, "he was even wounded, as though it were insignificant." I thought disgustingly, civilians, but I just nodded and told her that I had served in the Army for nearly 3 years, not bringing up the subject of Vietnam. We struck up a conversation that continued until she announced it was time for her to leave for class. After gathering her books, she bid farewell and left through the door. I regretted seeing her go. I had my first real conversation with her after returning home. When I heard a familiar voice ask, "Hey, mind if I sit here?" a few days later, I was sitting in almost the exact same spot. This time, I answered a little more logically than the previous time. She began talking to me as if we were best friends, even though I was trying to lose myself in the book. It turned out that we both had long breaks between classes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. After a while, she paused and blushed slightly, saying, "Did I just realize that I'm babbling away, and I don't even know your name?" Feeling a little embarrassed, I held out my hand and said, "It's Phil. Phil Robinson." She laughed and said, "Sally Baxter. Nice to meet you." We met for nearly the whole break over the following few weeks. She told me almost the whole story of her life, including her plans for college and her parents, older sisters, friends, and career. She was not only attractive but also gregarious, disposable, and outgoing. Her disposition struck me as very Jace-like. Not much else aside from my family and classes was what I told her. I sidestepped any inquiries concerning the Army. To be honest, I liked to hear her. I would still listen if she read to me from the phone book. She had me completely enthralled. She had, for some reason, captured my attention and reignited my interest in something besides school. For the first time in weeks, I started shaving in the morning following the second visit. I actually went and got a haircut and started dressing less carelessly after the third or fourth time. My mother began questioning me as soon as she saw that I had changed. Sincerely, I acknowledged that I had made an interest in someone. She gave me a little playful jab, but it was clear that she was enjoying herself. I got the nerve to ask her out a few weeks after we first met. She immediately said yes, seeming pleased. She drove from home to class, just like me. Keep in mind, my dad can sometimes be hard on guys who ask me out. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she laughed when I asked her to meet me on Friday night. "Sally, I think that for the privilege of dating you, the least I can do is put up with your dad for a few minutes or a lifetime." I thought to myself. She blushed and said, "Oh, what a flatterer." I found out that she blushes easily. When I knocked on her door on Friday night, a friendly-looking woman answered. She took my hand and pulled me inside before I could say anything more. "You must be Phil. We've been expecting you. Please come in." She turned to face me and said, "Don't worry about Sally's father. He's really not as bad as she thinks he is. By the way, my name is Emily," and she shook the hand she was still holding. As she was doing this, she called over her shoulder, "Jack, Sally's beau is here." Her father emerged from around the kitchen corner as I was considering how to react to all of this. He was a large man, roughly the height of me, but he weighed over 80 pounds more. Stout, not fat. He pointed out his hand, said, "I'm Jack," and gave me a serious look. "Phil Robinson," I firmly shook his hand in response. "Come on into the family room. We can talk for a few minutes while Sally finishes her work." After passing through the kitchen, the three of us entered a warm, wood-paneled room that had a couch and a few plush armchairs grouped around a TV in one corner. A fireplace with a hearth and mantel that spanned the whole wall occupied one side of the space. A triangular wooden box with a folded American flag inside stood on one side of the fireplace. A wooden box with a glass front that I had seen in a few stores during my Army days stood on the other side of the mantel. They served as displays for medals, patches, and ribbons, among other military memorabilia. An M1 Garand rifle with its polished buttstock and saddle-style leather harness rested on a pedestal between them. It had a very formal appearance. A framed flag of the Marine Corps hung above the rifle. Everything appeared extremely daunting. "Sally said you were a Vietnam veteran," asked Jack as the three of us sat down at the table. "I was there for a while," I said awkwardly. "I was a Marine in Korea. I would have stayed, but I was wounded in the breakout from Pond and then wounded again in the retreat from Chosin Reservoir. After that, I couldn't get a physical examination." I nodded and said, "Yeah, Sally mentioned that. Tough times." I said, "I was a fire control specialist in a 155mm artillery battery. 155s are the workhorses of artillery," and he nodded in agreement. "In which region of Vietnam did you serve?" "You'll have to forgive Jack, he's kind of a military history buff," Emily interrupted. "He stays up to date on everything related to the war." "I understand, of course." "Our battery was all over IORE, Jack said, glancing at me as if he was having trouble determining whether I was a genuine soldier or just a bastard from the lower ranks. "It's not over," Emily said, "except for the screaming. Just wait and see," Jack snorted, staring at her. "Well, by the time I got there, the Marines were mostly out," he said. "Yeah, Vietnamization, that's a great term for take this country, it's yours, Jack." I was relieved when Sally entered at that point because I knew that this conversation would not end, and talking about Vietnam was the last thing I wanted to do. We spent a few minutes discussing school and our plans for the evening before saying our goodbyes and heading out. That night, we went out to dinner and a movie. I can't say I remember much about it as I was completely absorbed in our conversation. In the movie theater, we held hands and sat close, almost touching each other's heads. After the movie, neither of us wanted to end the night, so we stopped by the bar for a drink. I ended up walking her to the door a few minutes before she told her parents she was coming home. I stood in an awkward pose, really wanting to touch her, to kiss her, but at the same time afraid of ruining the evening. When she snatched the idea out of my hands, she reached up, wrapped her arms around my neck, and, almost touching my nose, looked into my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Phil, for a wonderful evening." Time stood still as I looked into her deep brown eyes. I swear I could look into her soul. Everything she was and everything she would ever become was completely open to me. In that moment, I realized I had fallen in love with her. I put my hands on her waist and kissed her gently. We cuddled like this every day for the next few weeks, at least. She put her arms around my neck, which I held tightly, and we looked into each other's eyes, hiding nothing. She reluctantly pulled away from me and went into the house. The following day, I called her, and we talked on the phone for an hour. We arranged another date for the middle of the week, and that was when we became exclusive. A few weeks later, when I told her that I had gotten a motel room for the following Saturday, she blushed, as she usually did, but then just smiled and nodded. The evening was everything I could have imagined. There were a few awkward moments when she saw the scars that Vietnam had left on me, but I reassured her that everything was repaired, and I felt fine. I whispered in her ear. Sally pulled back her face and looked down at me, tears glistening in her eyes and her lips curving into a smile. I love you too, Phil. I know you don't want to hear it, but I can't help it. I had no idea it could be this way. I want to lie like this forever. I laughed in relief and kissed the tip of her nose. I don't know about that, but I sure know I want to do it again and again and again. This time she laughed and then moaned as I still hard entered her. God, Phil, everything you want, everything. For the first time since losing Jace, I felt at peace with the world, that life was getting better, that I had a future with someone I loved and who loved me back. By the time we left the motel, exhausted in the wee hours of the morning, we knew we wanted to be together for the rest of our lives. That night, we talked about everything, about marriage, children, where we wanted to live, what we wanted to do with our lives. Although Sally was a year younger than me, she was a year ahead of me in school. She was graduating at the end of the spring, and I was graduating a year later. We decided that after graduation, Sally would go to work, and we would wait and get married right after I graduated. In the meantime, I would rent an apartment so we could be together until then. A week later, I took Sally home to introduce her to my folks. My dad, Dave, worked as a toolmaker at GM, and my mom, Donna, had been working as a part-time teacher's aide since my sister and I moved to middle school. Sally and my folks took an instant liking to each other. My mom later said they loved Sally not only for herself, but for the way she brought me out of my shell, and I was changed. I was happy. I couldn't stop smiling most of the time. I was so bad that the next time I saw my therapist, he kicked me out of his office and told me not to come back. Sally's father and I continued to have a wary relationship. I'm sure he was concerned about the man who had knocked his youngest daughter down, and the fact that we were close didn't help matters. The look on his face when we talked about living together before marriage was frightening. That changed a few months later when Jack and Emily invited us over for dinner. Jack and I secluded ourselves in the living room while Sally and her mother stayed in the kitchen, putting away food and talking. After a few minutes of small talk on the usual topics, Jack hesitated for a moment and then said, "Sally told me that you have some serious scars from your time in Vietnam. She asked me what might have caused them." I looked away, feeling uncomfortable for some reason. "Yeah, but it's not something I like to talk about, especially with her." Jack smiled and said, "I know what you mean. Civilians usually don't." After a moment, he said, "Phil, when you and I met, I was under the impression that you didn't see much going on over there." Reluctantly, I replied, "Not really, not until the last firebase I was at." After a moment's silence, he asked, "Which base exactly?" I hesitated again. "Ripcord." Jack's eyes suddenly widened. "Ripcord? You were on Ripcord?" I nodded. "In the summer of '70, he asked with some tension. I nodded again. I was somewhat surprised that he had even heard of Ripcord. The Army had done its best to minimize any news of that battle because of the high number of casualties we had suffered. This was not difficult to do since President Nixon's tour of Cambodia was taking place at the same time. At this point, Sally and her mom returned to the den, and we started talking about school and Sally's upcoming graduation. Jack and I never talked about it again, but from that moment on, Jack treated me like the son he never had. After that, things began to happen very quickly. Sally graduated from high school with honors. She got a well-paying job as an assistant buyer at a retail store nearby. She spent as much time with me as she could in my apartment, but her mom and dad had it in their heads that she should move in with me permanently. I graduated on time and got a job at General Motors as a draftsman before I even got my degree. 2 months later, we were married. Since we were both working, we were able to afford a small house on a large enough lot to annex if the need arose. A year later, our son Jason was born, named after my best friend. He was a miracle. 2 years later, we had Jesse. By then, we thought it was over, but after some hesitation, we gave birth to Allison 3 years after Jesse. The birth of our son was special, but it was the girls who wrapped their little fingers around me. Sally cut back part-time and moved into retail when Jason was born. She wanted to work at least part-time between having kids and eventually go back to full-time when all the kids went to school. Right now, her work hours fluctuated between 12 and 20 hours a week. That was fine with her because she was eligible for a large employee discount, and keeping the kids clothed was expensive. Since I started working, my work has steadily evolved. In the beginning, I was translating part designs into programs to create numerical control ribbons for automated manufacturing. By the time Ollie was born, we were watching the first computer AED design systems begin to be developed, and the company selected me to be part of a group to be trained on the very first implementation. Life was good, money was plentiful, and we could afford 2 cars and a modest but nice house. In between having children, we added a bedroom, bathroom, and recreation room. We had 3 beautiful and healthy children. We did many things together as a family. Every year, we took at least one family vacation with the 5 of us, and twice a year, Sally and I sent the kids to their grandparents for a long weekend somewhere just for us. I always thought our marriage was strong, and we weren't shy about declaring our love for each other. We hugged, held hands, and touched each other often. I would look at her and other guys' wives and think how lucky I was, and I often told her so. I had always thought we were all just as in love now and just as fervently in love with each other as we were 10 years ago. Now, I wasn't so sure. I could feel my life turning. Sleep eluded me most of the night, and I probably only managed to get a couple of hours of sleep. The next morning, I didn't go to the Y and staggered into the office, shut the door, and stared at the wall. I knew I had to come up with a plan of action. I had to somehow figure out what was going on. I could ask Sally directly what was going on. As far as I knew, she had never lied to me before. But if she was already hiding something, would she tell me the truth now? And how would I find out? I knew what I overheard. I knew what I saw in her eyes. I started doodling on my notepad and making notes on where to go next, what steps to take to figure out what was going on. But when it came to figuring out what I would do if things turned out to be the worst-case scenario, I was lost. I loved Sally, I loved my children. The thought of being without them scared the hell out of me, but even scarier was the thought that maybe Sally didn't really love me. For the next few days, I was like a zombie at work and at home. I couldn't think about anything else. Sally didn't even notice until Jay said something about my dad acting out. I just chalked it up to having a work project on my mind. Tuesday, I got back into my usual routine and went to play racquetball before work as usual. JN was there, and of course, Craig. The thought occurred to me that I had never seen JN without Craig, and vice versa. I realized that if John was involved in something, so was Craig. When I entered the locker room, they were standing at the end of one of the aisles, changing clothes and talking quietly to each other. When they looked up and saw me, John laughed, and Craig started smirking as if he was the only one in on the joke. I realized now that the smirk was a normal expression on his face. I tensed up and started to get angry. For the first time, I began to think of these two as my adversaries. John was an inch taller and maybe 10 pounds heavier than me, and Craig was a little shorter in stature and stocky. I usually beat them at racquetball, mostly because I'd been doing it longer and was in better shape. I controlled myself, and the 6 of us played a few pickup games. John and Craig were cordial, and we exchanged some small talk. Afterward, we all cleaned up and went to work. On Wednesday, I decided to check on John and Craig's whereabouts on Saturday. I called John at home from work and talked to his wife. I told her that I was one of the guys in his racquetball league and was calling to see if John could play on Saturday. She replied that as far as she knew, He was going to a business conference in Detroit in the afternoon and would be back on Sunday. My heart throbbed when I heard this. On a hunch, I called Craig's house and got the same answer from his wife. Slowly hanging up the phone, I sat down and stared out the window. It was true, it had to be true. The four of them had hooked up down there, but the question remained, how far did it go? It didn't matter, but it was too far. I was angry. A voice rang in my head, do something. Friday night after work, I stopped by my mom and dad's house. Dad had retired last year, and they were planning to spend the winter in Florida. In the meantime, they were spending a lot of time renovating the house, getting it ready to sell in case they found something they liked there. They also liked to take their grandchildren with them every chance they got. I told them I needed to talk to them, and we sat at the kitchen table with iced tea while I tried to figure out how to tell them. Finally, I sighed and said, I don't know how to say it, so I'll just say it. I think Sally is cheating on me. As soon as I said that, tears streamed down my face, and I practically sobbed. It was the first time I'd ever said the unthinkable out loud. Mom and Dad recoiled in shock. No, this can't be happening, not Sally. Sally wouldn't do that to you, she couldn't do that to you, whispered Mom, shaking her head. Why do you think that? Said Dad quietly. I recounted everything I had overheard and what I had learned. Mom sat and cried quietly, shaking her head. Dad reached out and pulled her to him, hugging her tightly. What do you want from us, Phil? Asked Dad. I need to know for sure. I have to be where they'll be tomorrow night. I know it's a lot to ask, but could you pick up the kids tomorrow and keep them until Sunday? I pleaded. Dad nodded. Sure, Phil, but I pray to God this is all a misunderstanding. I nodded. Yeah, me too, but it's hard to see how it could be. Shaking my head, I got up and left. When I got home, Sally, bouncing around, was finishing dinner when I walked into the kitchen. She turned around, put her arms around my neck, and kissed me. The kids are in the break room, dinner will be ready in about 20 minutes, she said cheerfully. I could tell her thoughts were already preoccupied with the weekend. She was practically flying like she was on speed or something. As I thought about it, it also occurred to me that we hadn't had anything since the previous Saturday. We'd missed our usual midweek meeting, probably because I'd been in a terrible mood all week and had taken sleeping pills a couple of times to get through the night. But Sally never brought it up either. I wondered how she would feel about the idea. I hesitantly said, Honey, I just realized that we haven't made love since last weekend, and you won't be home this weekend. How about we put the kids to bed early and make some time for ourselves tonight? Sally took her hands off my neck and stepped back a little. I saw the veil fall over her eyes again, and her smile became forced. Phil, I'd love to, but I got my period a little early today, she said hesitantly. I replied inexpressively, I understand. She raised her hand, stroked my cheek, and said seriously, as soon as your period is over, I'll explain everything to you, I swear, okay? All I could do was nod. Yeah, then it's a date, I muttered. She hugged me and happily went back to making dinner. I turned and slowly walked up the stairs to change. While Sally was on the pill, her periods were regular like clockwork. That was clear to me now. She was saving herself for tomorrow's date. If I didn't know what to do before, I did now. The anger was getting stronger, and the voice saying do something was getting louder. Making it through the entire dinner without showing all the emotions I was feeling was difficult. The kids were chattering away as usual, and Sally didn't notice anything. Could this be the last time we sat down to dinner as a family? I turned away as the thought brought tears to my eyes. The next day, we followed our usual Saturday routine. The older children cleaned their rooms after breakfast. Ally pretended to help. When they were done, they were able to watch cartoons. I fiddled around in the garage until it was time for Sally to leave. Then, I went back into the house. Sally was just coming down the stairs with her suitcase and yelling at the kids to behave while she was gone. Ally was standing right behind her and yelling, "Buy me something, Mommy, buy me something." Sally stopped at the foot of the stairs, dropped her suitcase, picked Ally up in her arms, and gave her a hug and a kiss. "I will, sweetie, be a good girl for Daddy." Sally handed Ally to me and kissed her, saying, "I have to go. I have to pick Debbie up in 20 minutes." I nodded. "Don't forget to call me as soon as you get to the hotel." "Which one?" She laughed and said, "I always do that. It's the Red Roof Inn in Rochester Hills." "Bye," and she walked out the door. I stood on the porch holding Ally in my arms and watched her drive away without looking back. As soon as she was out of sight, I slowly walked back into the house and yelled to Jazz and Jesse. I had at least 2 hours before Sally would call to let me know she had gotten there safely, more than enough time to do what I had to do. The two of them walked down the stairs chatting and asking me what I wanted. I told them we were going to Grandma and Grandpa's house for the night, so they needed to pack a bag with pajamas, a change of clothes, and their favorite toys. With a bit of fussing and no answers to the inevitable questions, I made them turn around and go back to their rooms. I helped Ally gather her things and led everyone out of the house and into the car. Mom and Dad were waiting at the door when we pulled up. I unloaded all my stuff and checked into the house. As I headed for the exit, Dad threw me a concerned look. "Good luck, Phil." "I hope you're wrong," I sighed. "I know, Dad, me too. Thanks for doing this. I'll call you in the morning." I headed home through the airport. I stopped at Avis and switched cars. I didn't want my car to be recognized where I was headed. A couple of hours later, I was still sitting in the kitchen, looking at the clock. The events of the week were replaying in my head with repetitive slowness when the phone finally rang after 1 o'clock. I stared at it stupidly, but then I came to my senses and picked it up. "Is that you, Phil?" I heard Sally's voice say. "Yeah, it's me. You didn't even say hello. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, just fine. Is everything okay with you?" I said with a bit of sarcasm. "I don't know what you mean by all sets, but we made it okay. We stopped for lunch on the way. We're staying in room 168, number 555-645-0168. We made small talk for a few minutes, then she said, "Debbie is waving at me. I have to go. We are spending the afternoon at the Meadowbrook Village Shopping Center. I'll see you tomorrow," and the phone clicked as she hung up without waiting for me to say goodbye. I thought, she didn't even say she loved you, and this morning when she left, she didn't say it either. I dialed the Red Roof Inn I'd found earlier and asked for a reservation. I asked if Sally Robinson had checked in. They replied that she was, and that I would be connected to her room. I said no, that would not be necessary, I would meet her later. I hung up and dialed the number again. This time, I asked if John Harrison was registered. I was answered that yes, but he hadn't registered yet. I said I would call back later and hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, trying to suppress the anger that was threatening to turn into a murderous frenzy. It was a frightening feeling that I hadn't experienced in years. I stood up, walked slowly into the workshop, and unlocked the door of the gun cabinet. I stood there, looking at Dad's old 16-gauge double-barreled shotgun, a 36-inch Winchester Model 73 rifle, and an old machine gun handle left over from when I was a kid. Dad gave me his old rifle when he and Mom planned to move before he retired last year. I bought a Winchester back in high school when I went deer hunting for a couple of years after Vietnam. I couldn't bear the thought of hunting again. I stood there, immersed in contemplation. I knew that if I took my gun with me, I might never see my children again. Bending over, I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out an old, beat-up shoebox. Littered in the corner, I carried the box upstairs and tossed it on the kitchen table. I rummaged through the pile of stuff until I found what I was looking for. I pulled the Cobra Scene knife I'd bought in Bangkok out of its sheath and felt the point. It was still sharp. Most of the hilt was stained a dark rusty color. I shoved it back in, bent over, pulled up my pant leg, strapped the knife to my calf, and covered it up. I gathered a few things I might need: driving gloves, a water bottle, a couple of candy bars. It was already 2 o'clock when I got behind the wheel of the car to start the 90-minute drive to Rochester Hills. I pulled into the parking lot of the Red Roof Inn and drove slowly along the building until I pulled up to room 168. I didn't see Sally's car, so I parked a couple of rows away from the room, turned the car off, and waited. I didn't feel like it, but I kept thinking and reminiscing about Sally and the kids. It was already 5 o'clock when a new red pickup truck I recognized pulled into the parking lot right in front of Sally's room. John and Craig got out of the car. They looked quite happy, laughing and talking. They pulled a couple of suitcases and a refrigerator out of the trunk and went into the next room. After about 45 minutes, they came out and got back in the truck. I followed them for a few miles until they turned into the parking lot of a bar called Tupper Pub. I stopped on the street and watched them go inside. I then slowly drove around the parking lot and almost immediately spotted Sally's car. I parked on the street so I could see both the front door and John's red pickup. I wondered if I should go inside, but the bar seemed small, and I was afraid of being noticed. I sat and listened to old country music and an endless string of She Made Me Wrong songs. It suited my mood. It was already 9 o'clock when the four of them finally left the bar, laughing, joking, and holding hands. Instead of trying to follow them, I decided to outrun them and head back to the hotel. At this time of day, I didn't think they were going anywhere else. Plus, by parking where I was, I could easily get on the road before them. I parked in front of their license plate with the windows down about 10 minutes before Sally's pickup and car pulled into the parking lot. The four of them got out of the car and stood in front of room 1, talking. I was close enough to see them in the lantern light above the door, but far enough away that I couldn't hear what they were talking about, except for occasional bursts of laughter. They seemed to be arguing good-naturedly about something. After a few minutes, John swung a coin out of his pocket, tossed it in the air, and caught it. Then he held his hand out in front of everyone to show which side was up. Some of the onlookers nodded approvingly, and Craig pulled an unresisting Sally to him and kissed her soundly, smiling. Debbie grabbed John's hand and pulled him into the other room, holding hands. The two couples laughingly went to different rooms, pointing and waving at each other. I sat stunned. Who had done who? What kind of game was this? As my mind wrestled with my anguish, with the realization of what was probably going on in room 168, the voice I had heard all week in the back of my mind began to escalate to a scream. Do something. Anything. Do what? It was obvious this wasn't the first time. They were too good with each other. I couldn't undo what Sally had already done. 10 years of marriage and starting a family. She'd ruined it all. And me? What good was that going to do now? I thought I knew the answer to that question. At least I'll sleep better knowing I tried. With that thought, John came out of Debbie's room, dressed only in boxer shorts and a t-shirt, with a beer in his hands. I glanced at my watch and suddenly realized I'd been staring at their door for over an hour. John looked around the building from head to toe to make sure no one could see him, then walked over to Sally's room and knocked on the door twice. A couple of minutes later, Craig came out wearing jeans, no shirt or shoes. He closed the door behind him, and they stood talking for a few minutes while John sipped his beer. Then they high-fived each other, and this time John went to Sally's room, and Craig went to Debbie's room. Suddenly it hit me what had just happened. I had lost my mind. Suddenly, a voice screamed in my head, "Do something." I felt a wave of madness wash over me. I couldn't stop myself anymore. I moved to the other seat, found my driving gloves, and pulled them on. I deliberately got out of the car and quickly walked over to number 168. I put my left thumb on the peephole with my left hand and knocked twice with my right hand. When the door started to open and John said, "What the hell, Craig?" my fist was already flying forward and hit John with all the anger and frustration I could muster. John's head snapped back, he backed up 2 steps and went down hard on his ass. He sat there in just his boxer briefs, closing his eyes and covering his face with his hands. I looked around the room, looking at the overturned bed and the ajar bathroom door. I could hear the shower running. I pulled up my pant leg and pulled my knife out of its sheath. His nose was mostly on the right side of his face. I tapped the handle of the knife on his nose to get his attention, then flipped the knife over. When he opened his eyes widened when he saw the tip of the knife in front of him. "How long, John? How long has this been going on?" I whispered wildly. "Don't lie to me," I said coldly. Maybe 2 years, he stammered. Fear was evident in his voice and eyes. "Then I suppose joining the same racquetball league wasn't a coincidence, John." No, he said, helplessly closing his eyes again in pain. I thought about that fact for a moment. He wanted to be near the man whose wife he was entertaining. "You're just a sick bastard, John. Look at me, John. If I ever hear you approaching Sally or any other married woman, I'll find you, and I'll find your wart. Do you understand me?" "Understand," I repeated. When he hesitated, "Yes," he wheezed at last. "In fact, you'll be better off if you go far, far away." John's eyes bulged with horror. Suddenly, the stench hit my nostrils, and I realized his guts had let go. At that moment, the shower noise stopped, and I heard the curtain being pulled back. Sally's voice came through the door. "Hey, John boy, I thought you were going to get in the shower with me. What's up?" And she giggled. I looked up just as the bathroom door opened, and Sally appeared in the opening. She was holding a towel and drying her hair. When she suddenly saw me, her eyes went wide, she gasped, her face turned pale as a sheet, and the towel fell to the floor. Her mouth opened as she tried to say something. Complete shock was evident in every muscle. "John boy doesn't seem well," I growled at her. I glared at her and took a step towards the bathroom. A look of panic appeared on her face as she took a step back and reached out with both hands to slam the door shut. I heard a click as she closed it. I turned and walked over to the nightstand next to the bed, taking the phone. I cut the cord in one swipe of the knife and then slipped the knife back into its sheath. I turned around and headed for the front door. I stopped at the door and looked around the room once more. Suddenly, I screamed in frustration and misery, then picked up the phone and threw it with all my might right into the bathroom. It crashed violently into the door and fell to the floor, causing a terrified scream from inside. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. I paused for a moment and realized that the job wasn't over yet. I walked over to another hotel room. Again, I put the thumb of my left hand to the peephole and knocked twice with my right hand. The door opened, and Craig laughingly started to say, "You guys sure are noisy," when my fist flew under his chin. I heard a short shriek from the bed and looked over at Debbie, who was sitting at the headboard, her eyes like saucers and a sheet under her chin. I knelt over Craig and felt for his pulse. He was alive, but faded like a light. I stood up and walked over to the nightstand next to the bed. Debbie let go of the sheet and pulled it down to her waist, covering her mouth with shaking hands, her frightened eyes looking at me through her fingers. I then picked up the phone receiver and with a quick jerk, pulled the cord from the wall. Then I stepped back to the door and turned around to look at her. "If you tell your husband you ran into me tonight, tell him I said hi," I said sarcastically. Then, changing my mind, I added, "Or maybe I'll tell him myself." I tossed the phone into the corner of the room and walked out, closing the door behind me. I stood outside, looking up at the night sky and breathing in the cool air deeply. I could feel the tension fading away, replaced by a soothing tiredness. The do-something voice was gone. Everything was done, and I knew what else I needed to do, the only thing I could do. Purposefully, I headed to my car to start moving on with my life. "Yes," somewhat abruptly, I said into the phone. I was annoyed by this interruption, even though I had been expecting it all morning. I was immersed in thinking about Jason, Jesse, and Ally. They were the most important part of my life now, and figuring out how to shield them from the consequences of what had happened was my highest priority. "Phil, it's Jack." "Yeah, Jack," I replied without enthusiasm. "What's going on in there?" "Sally was here at the house when her mom and I got home from church. She's crying and says she's afraid to go home." Jack said this forcefully, almost shouting. I looked at the clock. It was almost 1 o'clock in the afternoon, almost 14 hours since I had left Rochester Hills. I don't know what I could have done to make her feel that way, I said. She says you lashed out at a couple of Debbie's friends they ran into last night, hurt them pretty badly. Hurt them? They're lucky I didn't kill them, said I sarcastically. Phil, what the hell, that's not like you. I thought for a moment about how to respond to that statement. In the end, I just asked my question, did Sally tell you where this fight took place? She said it was outside a restaurant in the Rochester Hills neighborhood. So, she was trying to get out of it while her family, her history. Sally is your daughter, so I guess it must be true, I said slowly. There was silence on the phone, and I sensed Jack was trying to process all of this. Phil, I'm going to bring Sally home. I want to know what's going on. We need to talk. No problem, I wasn't going anywhere. Jack hung up abruptly, but not before I heard in the background, "No, Dad, no." I sighed. She's not going to make this easy. I thought I was sitting at the kitchen table, looking at old photos and mementos that were in my shoebox and finishing my second beer when they pulled up. Jack walked into the kitchen, followed by Sally, who tugged on his arm. Please, Dad, let us work this out. Phil and I need some alone time. I looked closely at Sally. Her makeup was smudged, her hair loose, her eyes red and puffy. She was trembling as if she'd had a massive nervous seizure. She didn't return my gaze, holding onto her father's hand and trying to guide him back toward the door, but Jack wouldn't budge. Jack sat down in front of the kitchen table and stared at me. He looked at me and at the cobra knife lying on the table next to my beer in silence. Finally, he said, "Okay, Phil, what's going on?" I looked at Sally and said mockingly, "Yeah, Sally, tell your daddy what's going on." She turned to me and said fiercely, "Shut up, Phil. You and I can work this out." Her voice was commanding, but her eyes pleaded with me. I was infuriated that she thought things could be fixed if only we were alone, or that she thought she could manipulate me. I was determined to be as honest as she was lying. "And she's the one who dragged her parents into this," I said. Jack looked at me in disbelief. "No, Phil, Sally wouldn't do that." "I don't believe you." Jack started to get angry with me and said, "That's enough, Phil. Now you're being cruel and disrespectful." I shifted my gaze from Sally to Jack and back to Sally again. I could feel the anger overcoming my feelings of hurt and sadness. "Cruel and disrespectful, you say?" "Not even close, Jack. I'll tell you what's cruel and disrespectful. You would have seen what I saw last night in her hotel room, another man's footprints," I stated in a voice devoid of emotion. Jack turned quickly to look at Sally. Judging by the frightened expression on Sally's face, it was obvious that I was telling the truth. Suddenly, Jack collapsed in his chair as if his spine could no longer support him. Jack's expression crumpled. He covered his face with his hands and whispered, "Oh God." Sally turned pale, her eyes starting to water. "Please, Dad, don't tell Mom. We can work this out, Phil, can't we?" "Please, Phil, please," she pleaded. I sat in silence, rearranging old photos, going through souvenirs from an old shoebox, thinking back to a time when I was in incredible pain. After a few minutes, Jack straightened up and wiped his eyes. He looked at me expressionlessly. "What are you going to do, Phil?" he asked, watching the tears continue to flow down Sally's face. I sat and thought about this question for a few minutes. Finally, I said slowly, "I never told either of you about Vietnam or Ripcord." I sighed. Hell, I never told anyone about Ripcord, not even my therapist. I waved my hand at the pile of stuff on the table. "Isn't it ironic, Jack, that your generation displays its war memorabilia for all to see and admire, while my generation puts our reminders in a shoebox and hides it in the bottom drawer? Why is this so?" I asked rhetorically. I held up a faded photograph of two tanned, barefoot, skinny young guys in baggy jungle uniforms with badges around their necks. They grinned at the camera like Vietnam was a Boy Scout outing. Had I ever been so young? I certainly felt old now. I tossed the picture on the table between Jack and Sally and started talking like I was lecturing strangers. Jay and I were dropped off at Ripcord in May 1971. It was another base in a string of bases our battery was assigned to. We airlifted howitzers, set them up, conducted firing operations for a month or two to support the warriors making their way through the jungle, and then moved on to another base. We were in Vietnam for 6 months, and we had another 6 months before we had to rotate at home. But this time it was different. We were stationed on a desolate ridge surrounded by the thickest and most forbidding jungle we had ever seen, overlooking the A Shau Valley near the Laos border. The valley was a bad place for the U.S. military. In previous years, it had been the site of several bloody battles with many casualties. The Ripcord Fire Support Base was intended to support 4 battalions of the 101st Airborne, which were battling in the mountains on either side of the A Shau, trying to prevent the North Vietnamese Army from penetrating the coast from the Ho Chi Minh Trail. What a joke that was! The fire base consisted of our 155-gun battery, 115 battery, a mortar platoon, and a company of support infantry to guard the perimeter. We had 2 helicopter landing pads and several ash and debris units, probably no more than 400 men at any one time. Virtually the entire fire base was underground in bunkers, trenches, and tunnels. We learned later, near the end of the battle, that we were surrounded by about 12,000 North Vietnamese regular army soldiers. I looked sadly at Jack. "Does that remind you of anything, Jack? Like your Marines at Chosin Reservoir?" Jack nodded slowly and looked off into the distance, as if remembering another time and another place. I paused for a few minutes, gathering my thoughts and memories. The first 6 weeks or so weren't so bad, at least for us. But for those of us who were dropped off in combat formation on the hilltops around us, it was pure hell. We were almost constantly on missions to support them. Helicopters came and went from dawn to dusk. But we only occasionally took sniper fire or automatic weapons fire. But the helicopters coming in for a landing drew increasingly heavy anti-aircraft fire. On the 1st of July, everything changed. Just after 7 a.m., we came under mortar fire for the first time. For the first week, the NVA fired an average of 20 to 30 shells daily at us from 60 and 81 mm mortars. Then they started firing large caliber mortars of 120 mm, large caliber guns that had never before been brought outside the demilitarized zone. The bad thing was that because of the wind blowing across the valley and the sounds of helicopters and retreating artillery, most of the time you couldn't hear the incoming artillery. That first week, I was caught off guard, running from the mess hall to the fire control bunker when a mortar explosion knocked me off my feet. I jumped to my feet and made it to the FDC bunker in the least amount of time. As I slumped against the wall, trying to catch my breath, Jay looked up from his desk and said nonchalantly, "Damn, Phil, you're bleeding, of course." In my haste to get where I was going, I came out of the bunker without body armor. I never made that mistake again. The shrapnel hit me under my right shoulder blade. When I got to the infirmary, the surgeon took one look and decided to evaluate me safely to Camp Evans, our supply base, to have the shrapnel removed. An hour later, I was on my way. They extracted it with no problem but decided I had a concussion and decided to keep me for a couple of days for observation. By the time I got back to Ripcord, anyone who showed up from above had a more than equal chance of getting a shrapnel wound. The days went by, and the shelling got heavier and heavier. Not only mortars but rocket-propelled grenade launchers and recoilless guns. Toward the end, we were taking 70 to 80 shells a day. We began to suffer more and more losses. Our guns were in constant action. The muzzles of our howitzers were pointed almost straight upward as we fired at targets so close the batteries used up their main charge in 3 or 4 hours. Heavy Chinook supply helicopters flew in with pallets of ammunition suspended from slings and fired .51 caliber at the entire way. They would detach without landing and take off with all the speed they were capable of. Then all who were not otherwise occupied would rush to the landing stage and start tossing shells and boxes of powder charges to the batteries. During one of these operations, I received another half-dozen minor shrapnel wounds. Between the constant shelling, doing our regular work, and bringing ammunition to the guns when there was nothing else to do, we were constantly exhausted. There were artillery planes, F-4 Phantoms, and even B-52s constantly around us, conducting airstrikes on the hills. Smoke from shelling hung over the firebase, and sometimes clouds of CS tear gas, which the NVA liked to throw at us, made the air stink. After the 8th of July, when the Dinkies were first spotted in the wire, we were on alert almost every night. We all knew it was only a matter of time before the NVA would attempt a perimeter assault. We were all on edge, waiting for it to happen. As the shelling continued day after day, we began to take serious casualties. Morale was plummeting as we were left with the feeling that we had been abandoned. Before it was over, we had lost over 500 killed and wounded. At least a dozen times I was assigned to carry body bags or stretchers to the helipad for evacuation. On the 18th of July, the worst thing that could happen happened. A Chinook airplane carrying a load of howitzer shells came under fire and crashed right over a 115 battery and an ammunition supply point. The battery burst into flames like a Roman candle. Explosions and fires continued for several hours. All 6 guns were destroyed, and several dozen men were wounded. We were all shocked. I looked at Jack, tears streaming down his face. When the Chinook went down, many of us rushed to the battery to try to help. Several of the injured suffered burns when the aviation gas ignited. Jay and I reached down to lift one machine gunner and put him on a stretcher. When the skin on his arm, which I was holding, came off in the palm of my hand, I shook my head. "That and the smell of burning flesh I'll never forget," whispered I. Jack nodded at me with a grim expression, and Sally's face reflected horror. I took a deep breath and continued, "We all knew this place wouldn't hold up, but the brass didn't see it. All they saw was an opportunity to hurt the enemy. After all, we had almost 4 NVA regiments gathered in one place," I said bitterly. A couple of nights later, we were put on alert again. We were bombarded with automatic weapons all around the perimeter, as well as conventional fire. Jay and I had set up an M60 machine gun in a slot trench in front of the FDC bunker in case of a surprise attack. Our mortar platoon was constantly firing flares to illuminate the wire, and the infantry company was returning fire along the edge of the jungle. Every few minutes, artillery ships flew overhead and fired rockets or miniguns at suspicious NVA positions. Jay and I usually didn't try to return fire because there was a 3-man infantry position 20 to 30 yards in front of us, and return fire usually drew unwanted attention to our location. This night, the infantrymen were almost constantly popping up and firing M79 grenade launchers and automatic weapons toward the bushes. Every once in a while, tracer fire would return from the jungle. Then a volley of 20mm mortar rounds hit the infantry position in front of us. Jay and I ducked to the bottom of our foxhole as the ground shook. Stunned, we finally peered out from behind the edge of our position and saw that the infantry trench was completely covered. No one could crawl out of it. We quickly took up M60 positions, and Jay began returning fire while I fed him ammo from my belt. The platoon sergeant crawled over to us, and we told him what had happened to the infantry and that we would need more ammo. He nodded, ducked as low as he could, and rushed off toward the Tactical Operations Center. We were just reaching the last belt when suddenly I heard a shot from an M16 and felt as if my back and thighs had been hit with a baseball bat. I collapsed on the edge of the trench and stared into Jay's eyes, unable to move. I saw in his eyes the realization of what had happened to him. He moved his lips, trying to speak, but nothing came out. I reached for his hand, he squeezed it once, and then I saw the light go out in his eyes, and I realized it was the end. I looked up at Jack and Sally, but I didn't see them. Tears were streaming down my face. My best friend in the world was dead. My brother, except in name. I felt alone, so alone, I said brokenly. I wiped my eyes and tried to pull myself together. I could hear Sally sniffling. Whether it was because of Jay or because of her own difficulties, I couldn't tell. Finally, I continued, I turned my head with difficulty to look behind me. About 10 feet in front of the FDC bunker, Corporal Tran was standing in front of us, pointing an M16 at us. Tran was one of Kit Carson's scouts assigned to the 1001st Regiment. The scouts were mostly made up of North Vietnamese deserters who, for whatever reason, decided they were on the wrong side. Tran spoke English fairly well and sometimes acted as an interpreter when the infantry took prisoners or recovered documents from destroyed enemies. A couple of times, he took shelter in our bunker when we were shelled, and we ate together a few times. One night, Jay started teaching him how to play poker just for fun. Many of the scouts got clumsy when things got tense. If they thought there was a chance of being captured, they knew that, in that case, all that awaited them was a bullet to the head. Most of them had been locked in one of the bunkers a few days ago as the siege continued and their behavior became increasingly suspicious. None of us trusted them. I don't know if Tran was just scared or if he was an NVA infiltrator. I guess it didn't really matter. Tran fired a whole clip at Jay and me. I took a couple of bullets in the back, but my body armor saved me from all but a couple of broken ribs and a severe concussion. One bullet hit the back of my thigh but didn't hit the bone. I felt myself starting to go into shock at the realization that Jay was really gone and I'd been shot. I fought unconsciousness, knowing that if I lost consciousness, I would probably die. I began to talk myself into getting angry, focusing on the enemy, and getting even with him. As the anger built up, my vision took on a purple hue, and I could feel the murderous rage taking over my mind. Noticing my movement, Tran tried to shoot at me again. Luckily, he had already emptied his clip. I fell down and played dead. Tran must have decided he was done with me because he dropped his rifle and jumped over our trench. He started waving a flashlight and shouting in Vietnamese into the jungle on the other side of the wire. I struggled to get up on my knees to see what he was doing. A rocket-propelled grenade flew out of the bushes, narrowly missing him and me, leaving a distinctive corkscrew-shaped trail of smoke, and exploded behind us. He was jumping up and down, waving his flashlight around like a madman, almost foaming at the mouth. In the light of the flares, I saw three figures dressed in khakis and helmets separate from the edge of the jungle and run toward the wire. As they approached, I discerned the distinctive satchel charges hanging from their necks and the AK-50 carbines they held in their hands, indicating they were sappers. I tugged on the M60 that lay beneath Jay. I could barely stand on my feet, but I managed to pick it up and point it in their direction. I knew I had to stop them before they could punch a hole in the wire. I managed to fire 2 long bursts before the belt was empty. I don't know if I hit them, but the 3 sappers went down, and Tran turned around and stared at me in shock. He screamed at me, saliva flying from his mouth, and he grabbed the machete hanging from his belt. Most scouts carried them with them to pick their way through the jungle on patrol. I just had time to put my foot on the edge of the trench and push off before Tran lunged at me. I dropped the M60 and managed to grab my knife from the sheath on my belt. We came face to face, almost unconscious. I ended up on his chest as he tried to push me away and reach for the machete. He failed. I don't know how long I sat like that, with the flickering light of flares, the noise of exploding mortar shells, tracer shells flying overhead, the rumble of howitzers, the smell of cordite, and burning debris in my nostrils. I felt like I was lost in hell. Suddenly, Eric, my platoon sergeant, pulled me by one arm, and Lieutenant Dixon, our FDC officer, by the other. Dixon was yelling at me to get back to the bunker, that the fast movers were coming to rain napalm on our perimeter, and we were too close to the wire. I paused in my narrative, took a sip of beer, and ran the tip of my knife across the 3 purple heart medals lying on the table in idleness. I arranged them in one sequence or another. Jack and Sally were silent, barely breathing. I could not look at either of them. Finally, I continued. It was about this time that I lost consciousness. I woke up in a medical bunker under an FO with a battalion surgeon and one of the corpsmen working on me. Doc told me that I would probably survive and that they would fly me out in helicopters as soon as dawn came. I ended up being flown out around noon, which was a miracle. Every helicopter that came in was under heavy fire. 2 had already been shot down. The helicopter I was flying in received several shells, including one that killed the crew commander. But that morning, before I left, the decision was made to evaluate Ripcord. I found out later that they took everyone out on the 21st and then bombed the hell out of the place. I shrugged. It didn't matter to me anymore. 24 hours later, I was on a flight to a hospital in Japan. I spent a week there, then I was transferred to Walter Reed for another month. While I was there, some colonel who had probably never heard of Ripcord went around handing out medals. They gave me this one for killing my enemies. I reached into the box, pulled out a piece of red, white, and blue silk with a silver star, and placed it on the table next to the purple hearts. It was identical to the one in the shadow box on Jack's mantelpiece. The doctors treated me well, and I'm told that after a couple of months of rehab, I'll be fine. I shook my head, but I wasn't fine. At least not mentally. I was having nightmares every night and waking up screaming. I couldn't get the sounds, the smells, the faces of the dead and wounded out of my head. I missed Jason's funeral, but I managed to go home on vacation before heading to S-Base. The first thing I did was visit Jace's mom and dad. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. They wanted to know everything about Vietnam, what we did there, and how Jace died, but they didn't ask a single question. Why did I survive and he didn't? I paused and said quietly, it's the same question I asked myself almost every day. I stared into space, reflecting on this dark time in my life. I was in therapy, but I still felt like I was withdrawing from the world. I didn't want to see anyone or talk to anyone. I did the bare minimum of what I had to do at Fort S to keep everyone happy. I immersed myself in college drafting classes so I wouldn't have to socialize with the other guys. After work, when it was time to get out of the army, I moved back in with my parents and continued going to school. Not because I really cared, but because I didn't know what else to do. I lifted my head and looked into Sally's eyes, and all the pain, resentment, and anguish of the previous night almost blinded me. And then I met Sally. I whispered. She suppressed a sob, lowered her gaze to the table, and refused to look at me. You brought me back to the real world. You were happy and totally interested in everyone and everything around you, and you were beautiful inside and out. All the things I thought I wasn't. And you made me want to get to know you. You made me want to truly live again and gave me a glimpse of what my life could be. And I fell in love with you. You saved me, and you gave me 3 wonderful children. For that, I will always be grateful to you, I said wistfully. For a few minutes, we sat there without moving. Finally, Jack cleared his throat and said quietly, What now, Phil? I turned my head tiredly and looked at him. Jack, I've been betrayed twice in my life. Both times, I lost my best friend, I said simply. Sally lowered her face into her hands and began to sob, whispering, No, no, no. All 3 of us sat in silence, Sally sobbing and Jack and I with tears in our eyes. Jack said quietly, Are you sure, Phil? You want to throw it all away because of one mistake? Sally raised her head, a flicker of desperate hope in her eyes. I knew that what I had to say would put a stake in our marriage, but I couldn't let the lie go. I shook my head and looked at him. It wasn't the only mistake, Jack. I found out last night that Sally had been cheating on me for almost 2 years, and it wasn't with just one man, I said. Sally sighed, closed her eyes, shook her head in despair, and sank into her chair, even paler than she had been before. I looked at her curiously. John didn't tell you, Sally, that he confessed to everything. I turned to Jack. Does that answer your question? I said. Jack slowly stood up and looked sadly at Sally. You are my daughter, and I should love you, but I have lost all respect for you. Jack stopped, unable to find the words, and just shook his head. Sally reached out to him, wanting to touch him, but he pulled away. He turned to me and said firmly, Phil, you don't deserve this. Do what you have to do, but please don't hurt her. I couldn't sit still for that. No, Jack, I'm past that, I said sadly, but if it makes you feel better, take this with you. I slipped the knife back into its sheath and held it out to him. Jack silently accepted it and turned toward the door, his shoulders slumped, and he was no doubt contemplating how he should tell Emily. As soon as the door closed behind him, the phone rang, but neither of us even looked at it. We just sat there, not moving, not talking, and not looking at each other. The ringing finally stopped, and the silence became even more deafening. Finally, I said, looking into space, I expected the cops to come to you this morning, not your father. Sally flinched at this and, stumbling, said, Debbie and I convinced them to make up a story about being attacked outside the bar. We hoped that if they kept quiet, you wouldn't call their wives. I thought for a moment and realized I was free now. There was no way they could change their story to be believed for a second. I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders until I remembered that everything around me was falling apart. I just hummed and asked, so, where are they now? Sally cleared her throat and fidgeted in her chair. They're still in the hospital under observation. You hurt them badly. John has a broken nose, cheekbone, and ribs. Craig has a dislocated jaw, a couple of broken teeth, and a concussion, I said bluntly. Don't forget their balls, Sally. Sally looked at me with fear and trepidation in her eyes. No, you did some serious damage to them. She hesitated for a moment. I never knew you were so cruel, Phil. Did you have to do that? I looked at her in bewilderment. You're defending those bastards? I said sarcastically. Before she could answer, the phone rang again. You should answer it. It's probably for you, I said and got up and went to the bathroom. I washed my face and looked at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and puffy. I looked just like I felt, old and haggard, at least older than my years. It had been an almost sleepless night. I went back into the kitchen. Sally was just standing there, staring at the phone in her hand. Slowly, she hung up the phone and slumped down on one of the kitchen chairs. When I sat back down, she said without looking at me, You had to, too. Did you have to tell Debbie's husband? I shrugged and replied, Why shouldn't I share his pain? He's already called John and Craig's wives, and he kicked Debbie out of the house. She's going to have to hire a lawyer to see her own daughter. She started crying again and mumbled, She fired me. She said it was all my fault. I laughed bitterly. Oh, that's just wonderful. Tell me, Sally, who introduced you to John and Craig? It was Debbie, wasn't it? In between sniffles, Sally asked, How did you know? You know, when I told Josh this morning what you and Debbie did last night, he didn't want to believe me. Called me a liar and accused me of trying to ruin his marriage. But as soon as I said John Harrison's name, he changed his mind. He turned pale as a ghost and started swearing like a sailor. It must have been the first time in his life he ever got angry. You told me years ago that this was Debbie's second marriage and she was estranged from her parents. It seems Debbie has a sister living upstate that she never sees either. About a year ago, Josh was auditing a company, and one of the people he worked with turned out to be Sarah, Debbie's sister. Sarah knew Debbie had remarried, and Josh knew Debbie had a sister, but they had never met. Anyway, they hit it off, and one night before he finished his audit, Sarah invited him to have dinner with her and Dave, her husband. She had a story to tell. It turned out that her husband, Dave, was Deb's first husband. Dave and Debbie started dating in college. They dated for 2 years until Debbie graduated from college and then got married around their wedding anniversary. Dave found out that Debbie was having an affair. He also found out that Debbie had cheated on him throughout their relationship. He kicked her out and filed for divorce. Debbie and her parents fought over this as well. Dave and Sarah then started dating and eventually got married. They now have a couple of kids and seem very happy. Of course, Debbie never told Josh about all of this. And guess who Debbie had an affair with during her first marriage? Surprise! It was John Harrison. I stopped, and Sally just stared at me in shock. Oh yeah, and when I mentioned Jay's name, Josh started putting the pieces together and realized that Debbie had been doing the same thing to him that you did to me throughout their marriage. No wonder he threw her out on the street. And I, like Josh, am wondering how long you've been messing around with me, I stated firmly. Sally cried again and said, "Oh my God, Phil, it was only John and Craig, and only during our shopping trips. Please believe me. I never ever even thought about anyone else until Debbie brought it up before our first shopping trip." She sat, twirling her handkerchief in her fingers, alternately crying and begging. "Please, Phil, I don't know how I got where I am now. It was like I woke up from a dream or maybe a nightmare when I opened the bathroom door and saw you standing there." I didn't say anything, just looked at her grimly. Encouraged, she began to speak quickly, almost babbling. I knew Debbie liked to play before we even started shopping. She talked about it like it was the most fun she'd ever had in her marriage. But I didn't expect her to hook up with anyone during our trip. I was totally surprised when John showed up at the restaurant and Debbie introduced him to me. She explained that she had known John since high school and that he just happened to be in the neighborhood. I suspected that wasn't true, but I didn't say anything. She paused, bit her lip, and looked away. John was at his best that night. Flirted, danced with both of us, paid me a lot of compliments. I had a couple more drinks than I was used to, and when his hands got a little loose on the dance floor, I pretended not to notice. Later, when we got back to the hotel, Debbie went with John. He had booked the room next to ours. I realized that Debbie had set the whole thing up. The hotel we were in was old, with thin walls. I could hear them doing it most of the night. "I guess that explains why you were like that when you came home that Sunday, doesn't it?" I said with disgust. Sally hung her head and nodded. She wiped her eyes and continued. The next morning, John was gone. We had breakfast, and Debbie told me in detail about their night together. She raved about him all the way home. Over the next few months, Debbie and I had lunch together at work a couple of times a week. As usual, she often mentioned John and how much fun she had with him. That's when I first heard about his wart. Debbie laughingly told me that I should try it one day because she couldn't explain it. At first, I just laughed at her, but the more she talked about it, the more the idea stuck in my head. A few months later, when another opportunity to go shopping presented itself, Debbie confessed that John really wanted to be with me, and she was fine with it if I wanted to be with him. I kind of laughed at that, but asked her what she would do if I did that. She said John had a friend, Craig, who would come over and keep her company. I didn't say no, and I don't know why. I told her I would think about it, but I don't think I could do it. Sally looked at me, and I just stared back at her expressionlessly. I knew it was wrong, Phil, but the thought crossed my mind that I could do it, and no one would know. Sally looked away again and said, that Saturday night, John and Craig came to the restaurant. We had dinner and a few drinks and then went to a nightclub. We split into couples, and I was with John. I had had enough to drink by then and convinced myself that nothing bad would come of it. Everyone was having a great time. Later, when we got back to the motel, John and I naturally went to our room, and Debbie and Craig went to theirs. Sally fell silent and just stared at her hands. Finally, I said dismissively, "So, was it as you thought it would be?" Sally looked at me with tears in her eyes. "It was okay. It wasn't any better than what you and I have. What made it so hot was that it was so wrong and it was with someone new, and I could pretend to be someone else. You mean it wasn't just okay? He turned you on so much that you forgot about your husband who was waiting for you at home, your husband who took care of your kids out of love for you so you could be alone?" I said bitterly. Sally suppressed a sob and turned away again. "Yes," she whispered, "and how do you explain Craig, my spouse?" I said sarcastically. Without looking at me, she replied, "After we slept with John a few times, Debbie joked that she was starting to miss him." I didn't think too much about it, but on the next trip, when we got separated into couples, I danced with Craig almost all night. Later at the motel, Craig came to my room, and he and I spent the night together. It didn't seem like a big deal then. A couple trips later, John and Craig switched in the middle of the night. I didn't realize it at first until I woke up late one night and realized that the man making love to me wasn't the man I started out with. Sally looked at me sadly. I felt like I was two different people living in two different worlds. I like our life together, you and me and the kids, but I got hooked on these weekends. I thought I could have both, and you would never know. How stupid could I have been? Damn stupid, I agreed, and then when you saw me at the motel, I looked at myself in the mirror and realized what I'd become, she whispered almost to herself. I stood up and looked down at her. Interesting story, Sally. Too bad it doesn't have a happy ending. Or maybe there is for you. I'm going to go get the kids tonight when Ally is asleep. You and I will sit with Jason and Jesse and tell them that their parents will be living apart. I think Ally is too young to understand. We won't tell them the real reason, and I'll do my best to minimize the trauma for them. I'll sleep on the couch in the basement until I make other arrangements, Sally shouted after me as I started to walk away. Phil, my God, this was a mistake. I love you. Don't do this, please, I turned and said, why not, Sally? Sobbing uncontrollably, she replied, it was only 3 or 4 nights a year. I never saw John or Craig or anyone outside of that weekend. Please, Phil, I'm begging you, can't you forgive me and let me make things right? Forgive you, Sally? Forgive you for being with other men 3 or 4 nights a year? For giving away the thing you cherished most in the world, yourself? Forgive me for destroying my trust in you? For destroying my belief that you and I belong to each other and no one else? I said sadly. And how would you fix that? Could you go back in time and start over? Can you not have fun with JN this time and not have fun with Craig? Because that's what it takes to make things right, I said tiredly. I stood silently, looking around the kitchen, the family photos on the wall, the kids' drawings and newspapers on the fridge, Ally's baby chair in the corner, all the things that made this house a home. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I spent most of last night without sleep, asking myself how I'll feel about you in 6 months, a year from now, or 5 years from now. I'm sure I'll be able to forgive you someday, but what I won't be able to do is forget. Not in a year, not in 5 years, not even in 10. Every time I see you, I will think of last night. Every time I hear your voice, I will think of last night. And every time I hear your name, I will remember last night, I said, with a hitch in my voice, tears in my eyes. That's what, Sally, I can't live with, I said, standing there unmoving, sadly contemplating the future, barely noticing Sally, who was rocking back and forth in her chair, alternately sobbing and crying, no, please God, no. After a few minutes, I said softly, can you answer me one question, Sally? She looked at me with empty eyes, like a condemned prisoner who knows there will be no commutation of sentence. You lost a man who loved you more than anything in the world. You lost the respect of your parents, the respect of my parents, and the respect of your husband. You've lost your job, and someday you'll have to explain to our children why you destroyed our family. Was it worth it? After a moment of silence, broken only by Sally's muffled sobs, I turned and slowly walked out the door. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.